listen to Professor Roger Sandilands, who is economy professor with Strathclyde University in Glasgow, and visiting professor at Singapore, Lima, Tokyo, and Beijing universities. He's a consultant in Chile and Colombia, and he has authored numerous publications. Professor Sandilands, you have the floor. In my speech, I would like to share my experiences in Latin America and in Asia regarding the importance of housing and the value of land. And I will now shift to English.
Focuses on the role of housing in economic development and its impact on urban land values. I refer particularly to potential lessons for China from the experiences of Colombia and Singapore, where I have spent many years. Since abandoning the madness of Maoism, China has achieved unprecedentedly strong economic growth. Her per capita income is now more than $6,000 in purchasing power terms. But what's notable about China is the extraordinarily low proportion of its population which, at this level of income, is still living in rural areas and has not yet been urbanized. Her well-known so-called hukou licensing system for housing and residences in the cities is largely to blame. It severely restricts migration of impoverished rural families seeking a better life. This explains why the gap between rural and urban incomes is unusually large and growing. Worse, within the rural and urban areas, inequality is also high and rising. Land is at the heart of these trends. The World Bank recently produced a major assessment of prospects for China over the next 25 years. It estimates that in real terms, land values overall are doubling every 12 years in real terms. In the major cities, they're rising even faster, albeit with big ups and downs associated with speculation. Unfortunately, the World Bank draws odd conclusions from this. To quote from their report that came out just last month, land, along with investment, has fueled China's extraordinary levels of urban development and industrial growth, and has contributed to maintaining social stability, unquote. First, this statement glosses over the widespread instability and violent protests connected with the corrupt requisitioning of rural land in China. Second, their claim that it is land that has produced much of this growth is misconceived, for land does not produce wealth. Rather, land is the passive recipient of wealth produced by the active factors of labor and capital. Be a country ever so rich in natural resources, without labor, capital, and knowledge, nothing is produced. If land is fixed, as it is, production can only increase through more labor, capital, or technology. In 1897, Henry George distinguished value from production and value from obligation. Neoclassical economists ignore this distinction and take all incomes as equal measures of productive contributions. Thus, they justify private appropriation of monopoly rent. Worse, by conflating land with capital, God-given land with man-made capital, as they do, there is no rent. All incomes are of similar nature. And then there are only profits from enterprise, no rents. In this way, the neoclassical economist avoids the ethical issue altogether. Naturally, this theory neither explains progress nor why progress marches hand in hand with poverty. Now let me briefly explain the main economic forces that drive urbanization, and from that, the impact on land values and inequality. The shift in countries' economic center of gravity is conventionally explained by the push and the pull forces of supply and demand. However, this distinction between supply and demand is not clear-cut because these forces interact. One sector's supply is ultimately the demand for other sectors' supply of goods and services in exchange, one for the other. Nevertheless, consider first the side of demand. In early stages of development, people must spend most of their income on food and basic necessities, clothing and shelter. Agriculture then dominates the economy. Being land intensive, this forces people to live in scattered rural communities. As incomes grow, more is spent on food, but less as a proportion of income. The proportion rises for other things. Supply responds to demand, and labour and capital are pulled toward the production of urban-based manufactured goods and services. Next, consider the supply side. The Green Revolution, with its miracle seed varieties and improved capital, gives rise to huge potential productivity gains. Why then have actual productivity increases often been disappointing? A superficial answer is that there has been underinvestment in agriculture. A deeper answer is that, quote, markets clear at the short end. That's to say, if productivity and potential supply increase faster than effective demand, prices fall until actual supply matches the slower increase in demand, so that the increase in production is not the same as the increase in productivity that is the potential of the Green Revolution. So when productivity outstrips sales, it's because the innovators' lower costs have driven innovators out of the market. The latter, the non-innovators, are then forced either into subsistence farming or to migrate in search of alternative work. The increased output of the modernizing farmers in this way is partly offset by the non-innovators' loss of market share. So this explains the push or labor displacing effects on migration. However, there are simultaneous pull effects from the Green Revolution. For increased agricultural productivity increases urban employment opportunities. That's through the way in which it lowers food and raw material costs, and this benefits consumers as their prices fall. And it also thereby lowers the cost for urban employers in hiring workers. With increased real incomes, there is then increased demand for primary products from agriculture. Farmers can then invest more to increase productivity, though this will further displace farm labour. Increased productivity means you need less labour per tonne, and if the demand is inelastic, then the increase in demand fails to offset the fall in unit costs, which are basically falling unit labour requirements. When we see that in China the rural-urban wage gap has not narrowed, this suggests that push has dominated pull. This net push effect keeps rural wages low, and this in turn keeps urban wages down, particularly the wages of the more recent marginal migrants into the cities. And all this despite the increased wealth of the cities, thanks to the agglomeration economies and so on that are inherent in major concentrations of population in the cities. However, unlike in agriculture, there is no inherent conflict in the cities between rising productivity and more jobs, because for urban goods and services, despite the rapid rise in productivity, the increase in demand, which is much more elastic, offsets the lower unit labour cost per unit, and so there's no conflict as there is when productivity rises in agriculture. Much depends on where the elasticity of demand falls. Also, many urban services are inherently labour-intensive. They're inherently labour-intensive. This explains why the share of income going to services increases as the economy grows. This is a universal phenomenon. Nonetheless, the continuing pool of effectively redundant rural labour, desperate to share in the relative prosperity of their city counterparts, indicates that the cities need to do even more than they have done to ensure that the pull of city jobs can dominate the push or displacement effect from agriculture, instead of the other way round. So I turn now to potential lessons from Colombia and Singapore. First, the Colombian experience. The growth of resource-abundant Colombia falls greatly below her potential. But her population has grown rapidly from around 10 million in 1950 to close on 50 million today. In 1950, her urban population was 33% of the total. By 1960, it was 45%, a similar percentage to what prevails in China today. But in the absence of adequate housing in central locations, a large proportion of the migrants settled on the peripheries of the cities, in barrios de invasión, or squatter settlements. Industry and commerce clearly needed a better housed workforce. They also needed more factories, offices, shops, and social infrastructure. All of these building projects have two things in common. First, they're very long-lasting projects. And secondly, they're very costly relative to incomes. Thus, these investments almost always necessitate outside funding, repayable over a long period during which the buildings provide their annual services. Without long-term finance on affordable terms, these homes and factories and infrastructure will not be built. In particular for households, monthly debt servicing costs must be less than rents for comparable existing properties. This was the background to the 1972 national plan in Colombia, known as the Plan of the Four Strategies. Its author was Lachlan Curry, with whom I worked for many years, and Curry was Franklin Roosevelt's economic advisor in the White House for several years, from 1939 to 45. And in 1949, he headed a World Bank mission to Colombia and stayed on as a top advisor until his death in 1993. He wrote the main background paper for the United Nations 1976 Vancouver Habitat Conference, the one that inaugurated Habitat, UN Habitat. And he drafted its action plan on recapturing plus value, in Spanish, plus valer, la captación de plus valer. As Curry expressed the problem at the Vancouver conference, quote, "It is a striking example of our economic illiteracy that we have quietly acquiesced in the private appropriation of socially created gains, letting fortunate owners and their heirs levy tribute on the national income to which they have contributed nothing." Generally, the case for capture of the pure monopoly gain of rising urban land has been impaired by failure to distinguish between land and capital, God-given land and man-made capital again, also between land and building, and between the rise reflecting inflation and that traceable to pure scarcity. Curry's 1972 plan was designed to accelerate Colombia's development by boosting urban employment. In brief, the four interrelated strategies were: 1, a new housing finance system, together with a more compact type of urban design. 2, a boost to non-traditional exports by ensuring that the exchange rate would no longer be chronically overvalued by the way in which domestic inflation was not reflected in the exchange rate, its external value. Thirdly, a strategy to increase agricultural productivity, partly through greater investment expected to result from higher demand associated with accelerated growth of incomes that would be the result of the